Welcome, crime enthusiasts and mystery seekers. Today, we unravel a real-life detective saga that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our intriguing investigations. Without further ado, let's dive into the captivating world of crime and justice. In the middle of the German countryside, a small farm called Hinterkaifeck became the unlikely center of attention when a gruesome murder of 6 people was committed in 1922. In the decades following the massacre, the attacker or attackers remained unknown, leaving behind strange traces which have baffled the authorities since they were discovered. The farm Hinterkaifeck was home to 6 people, a fragmented family that settled there in 1886. The father of the family, Andreas Gruber, was a servant before marrying the widow Cecilia Gruber. Later, she became a mother and co-owner of the farm. About a year after their marriage, in 1887, they had a daughter, Victoria Gruber, who raised her on the farm with them. Later in life, Victoria married Carl Gabriel, named her Victoria Gabriel, but for the sake of simplicity, we will call her Victoria Gruber. Carl later died in World War I, leaving behind his wife and newborn, Cecilia Gabriel. And the last family member is Josef Gruber. But who were Josef's parents is not clear. When Cecilia became a widow, her neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer, also a widower at the time, claims that he had an intimate encounter with her, which resulted in Victoria becoming pregnant. However, Lorenz denied paternity and claimed that Victoria's father was the father and that they had an incestuous relationship. Finally, after a few months of back and forth, Lorenz accepted paternity and became Josef's legal father. It is worth mentioning that another person lived on the farm who technically was not a family member, but a maid or servant named Crescence Rieger. According to people familiar with the family, they were described as eccentric, hard-working, but somewhat reserved and withdrawn, which makes sense because the family's closest neighbors were nearby, about half a kilometer away in the town of Gruber. The actual farm can be divided into 3 parts: the family residence, the barn where the cattle were kept and fed, and the area where the farm equipment was. Now it is important to mention that there was a 4th smaller area, a kind of shed, which was later built for an engine, presumably to cut hay or straw for cattle. This little motorhome takes us to the beginning of our story in the Hinterkaifeck farm, days before the massacre. Days before the massacre, strange things happened on the farm in the weeks before the murder. In the early morning of March 30th, the father of the family, Andreas, found fresh footprints in the snow in the machinery workshop, but none in the forest. Investigating the place, he found that the door of the room was torn open and someone was inside, but surprisingly, nothing was stolen and the intruder disappeared. It is generally believed that an intruder or intruders tried to enter the farm, but when they realized the camper wouldn't let you in, they gave up. How they left without making new tracks in the snow is unknown. Later that month, the family found Munich in a strange magazine that seemed to have fallen on their farm. Since no one in the family bought or subscribed to this magazine, Father Andreas first thought that the postman had lost it on the property. Although Andreas tried to return it to him, the postman claimed that the magazine was not part of his delivery. Andreas even asked the surrounding neighbors if their letter was mixed up with his, but he found out that none of his relatives had ever subscribed to the magazine. One of the family's neighbors also claimed that he saw Victoria fighting with an unknown man at the Weidhofen cemetery. He even claimed that he saw Victoria hit a man, but this fact has yet to be proven and remains a rumor. Victoria Gruber's maid and family heard strange sounds coming from the attic for several days in the months before the murder. After hearing their concerns, Andreas searched the attic and found nothing significant that could be causing these strange sounds. However, the maid recently gave birth to a daughter in Hinterkaifeck, and the thought of breaking into the manor or even haunting it forced her to give up this job. He was later questioned about the decision. I would also like to mention that at that time, often at 12 o'clock in the morning, the door of my cell suddenly opened even though it was locked. I never saw anyone. After this happened almost every day at the same time, I got scared and decided to quit my job. So after the departure of Crescens Riga, they hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. He had arrived at the farm on March 31st, 1922, for his first day of work and was accompanied by his sister. They met and said goodbye to the Grubers before Maria and her sister parted ways. This was probably the last time anyone outside saw Mary or the family alive. Later, during her short visit, the nurse said only this about the farm. "I didn't notice anything outside. The farm seemed so incredibly lonely to me." The day of the murders. What really happened on the night of March 31st and the following morning is largely unknown. Let's start with what we know. On the morning after the murder, on April 1st, 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, the older of the two children, did not come to school. Cecilia's school brother later admitted that she was often absent, so he didn't think it was unusual. However, some people began to doubt. One of the few neighbors of the family, Michael Pohl, later said in his statement that I noticed an extraordinary silence in Gabriel's house, especially with the dog. But at that moment, no one was suspicious enough to go and search the house. But as the days passed, more and more people noticed the silence. A hunter passing the farm noticed that there was no smoke coming out of the family's chimney. The family missed the church, and several salesmen and postmen were silent. The event, however, that really alerted the neighbors that something was amiss was the engine repair the family ordered a few weeks earlier. Arriving at the farm, repairman Albert Hoffner says, "When I got there, I wanted to enter through the garden door, but I couldn't because it was locked. I then went around the house to enter from the back. I looked through the kitchen window to see someone, but I didn't. I noticed the loud howling of the cows, but I did not notice because I often heard that the owner of the farm was strange and did not come home from the field all day. Since there was no one in the house, I parked my bicycle and sat on it. I waited for about an hour, occasionally whistling to announce my presence. Finally, I got tired and thought I had to work or I couldn't finish because I also had another solution in that area. I went into the engine room, examined the latch, and found that it was only locked with a small padlock, and opened it. Once I was in the engine room, I immediately got to work. That repair took about 4.5 hours and was completed at about 3:30 p.m. However, none of the family came, so I locked the motor engine again and left. After the repairs were completed, Albert Hoffner began to spread information about Hinterkaifeck condition in vain, which attracted the attention of one Lorenz Schlittenbauer. If you remember the beginning of the video, it is the same man who denied the paternity of Josef Gruber. But after discovering that there was no sign of the Gruber family, he says, "The fact that they disappeared struck me as suspicious, and I thought I should investigate. Then I told my two sons to go to the house to see if anyone was there. Shortly afterwards, my sons returned and reported that they had seen no one and heard only cattle in the barn, and I went with two neighbors, Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel, to search thoroughly the house. When they arrived, they found all the doors locked, except the one leading to the machinery area. This area of the facility gave no clues to the team, so they continued. When I opened the shed dodo, I noticed nothing about them. But after walking a few steps into the barn, Michael hit a leg coming out of the haystack. In his statement, he says, "I turned and grabbed the leg, pulled it into the corner, and realized that it was Andreas Gruber. I looked closer and realized that there were more people on the ground." Later, it was confirmed that the 4 people they found in the barn were indeed the 2 Cecilias, Victoria and Andreas. His statement continues, "When I saw that the bodies showed no signs of life, I went to the apartment through the stable corridor to look for my son. Then I went to the kitchen and then to the bedroom. There I found my son lying in a cart with his head crushed." Lorenz then describes how he found Maria, the maid who had worked only a few hours earlier, dead under the covers in her room. After finding the child-murdered residents of Hinterkaifeck in their farm, the group informed a nearby mayor of Wangen. Gregor He and 2 policemen from another nearby town went to the crime scene, followed by a policeman from Schrobenhausen. The next morning, they began a thorough inspection of the site and discovered that most of the victims' injuries were blows to the head with a blunt object like a murder weapon. The skulls of the victims were crushed or broken by the implement because the perpetrator seems to have focused on crushing the heads of the victims rather than any other part of the body. However, Cecilia was found to have the strangest set of injuries, as her autopsy revealed not only a blunt severe injury to her head, but also a large gash in her throat that was not found on any of the others. Cecilia's body also showed signs of self-inflicted scratch marks on her throat as she tried to cover her wounds with her hands. On her body were also tufts of hair, most likely her own hair, which she pulled out while she was dying and in pain. His time of death was determined to be approximately 2-3 hours after the murder, making him the last member of the family to die. During the initial investigation, the investigators found a log leaning against the wall in the stable. It was initially believed to be a murder weapon, although this does not explain how the victims suffered blunt force trauma. Although a year after the first murders, a garden hose was found above the main building, which matched the shape of the victims' head injuries. It was later found to be a murder weapon. By this point, the police had developed a rough theory to explain what really happened on the night of the murder. The author or authors came at night, probably while the family was getting ready for bed. This, together with the fact that the family's nearest neighbor was in another village, probably assured the criminals that they would not be caught. When you got to the farm, you probably went through the engine room door and then through the barn door. As the family were probably getting ready for bed, they would all be in the parlor on the opposite side of the farm. Now, one of the first policemen on the scene, he says, "The door leading from the stables to the barn is so narrow that only one person can enter at a time." He concludes that it was not the case that all 4 family members were lined up and killed one after the other, because if one person had been killed, the other 3 would have panicked and escaped. So the theory is that the criminals lured the family members one by one into the barn and killed them there. It is not known how the manufacturers actually managed to lure each member of the family one by one. In any case, the authorities also believed that the perpetrators stayed at the farm for some time after the crime. It was clear that the criminals tried to hide the bodies, because there were 4 bodies in the barn under a stack of hay, Josef Gruber in a cart, covered with a piece of cloth, and Maria, a fence, blanket on the floor. In fact, the crime scene photo of Maria's room shows clothes hanging on the windowsill, and some theorize that this was an attempt to block the view of the room from the outside. In addition, there were reports and statements that one of the neighbors, Michael Plockel, passed by the farm before discovering the murders and saw a stove burning in the yard. After the police got all the clues from the house, they immediately started looking for the criminal. 3. Suspects. Since the 1922 murder, the search for suspects has relied heavily on unreliable witnesses, local hearsay, and pure speculation, which means that many of the theories and suspects are completely unreliable. One theory that proves this is the resurrection of Carl Gabriel. Carl Gabriel was the husband of Victoria Gabriel, who was sent to serve in the First World War and died in 1915. Although the case had little evidence and even fewer suspects, it was theorized that Carl Gabriel somehow survived the war and returned to Hinterkaifeck, where he found his ex-wife carrying another man's child. Angry and betrayed, Carl Gabriel murdered his wife and her entire family for the crime. While this theory is interesting, it is probably just speculation because authorities investigated Carl Gabriel's death and found no reason to suspect that he was actually dead. Some suspicions were, however, justified. One of the earliest and best-known suspects was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor of the Gruber family and the possible father of 2-year-old Josef, son of Victoria. Lorenz was also the first person to find the bodies of the Gruber family, and his behavior at the crime scene first cast doubt on his innocence. First, when Lorenz first came to check on the family, the doors of the house were all locked, so he and his friends had to break through the gate to enter the barn. But after entering the barn and finding the bodies, Lorenz separated from his friends and opened the front door with a key. How he got the key is unknown, although some have speculated that because he was a well-known neighbor, the family may have given him the key. Others have speculated that Victoria secretly gave him the key so they could meet the lovers, though that is all speculation. It is worth mentioning that in the days before the murder, Andreas Gruber, the father of the Gruber family, lost his house keys. This made Lorenz suspicious, not only because he had the key to the family farm, but because he wanted to enter the house alone, not knowing if the killer was still there. When asked about this, Lorenz claims he had to go to the farm to check on his son Josef, who was also killed in the murders. Second, when Lorenz found the bodies, he moved them from their original location, pulling them out of the grass they were hidden under, disturbing the crime scene. In the months after the murders and during the investigation, Lorenz was accused of knowing too much about the murders and the crime scene because he had facts that only the police supposedly knew. In his defense, he claimed it was because he was a familiar neighbor of the Gruber family and had visited their farm many times, so he had intimate knowledge of the land and property. As for motive, it is speculated that Victoria would have asked for alimony from Lorenz and that angered him enough to send him on a murderous rampage, although admittedly that is pretty far-fetched and pretty much all speculation about Lorenz's. Motive is based on pure hearsay. Around the same time, another suspect began to gain attention, a man named Anton Bichler, who wanted to marry his former servant Crescens Rieger months or years before the murder, but the Hinterkaifeck family allegedly tried to divorce them. Crescens says in his statement, "Shortly after I began my duties at the Hinterkaifeck home, factory worker Anton Bichler proposed to me. I reported this to the Grubers, but they advised me not to, because Bichler always steals. They also expressed their suspicion that Bichler was stealing chickens from them. He also visited me when I gave birth. After that, he came back to my window several times, but I never let him into my room because I didn't want to mess with him. When I didn't answer his pleas for love, I was informed that Bichler reported that the Gruber family was to blame for our not getting together. Also, Bichler reportedly said the Kaifeckers should be killed. It is said that Anton knew the family house because he helped them many times with potato chewing and threshing, and the family dog, who is usually cheerful and barks at strangers, never barked at Anton." In the same interview, Crescens mentions another name, Georg Siegli, who he says expressed the same views about the Hinterkaifeck family and thinks he may have committed the murders with Anton. When I heard about the Hinterkaifeck murder, my first thought was that the Bichler brothers and Siegel did it. Anton Bichler was arrested in 1922, but was not charged with murder, and it is not known whether Georg was arrested or not. In cases this old, the evidence, motive and details are all behind hearsay and speculation. The details of such cases often disappear over time, eliminating any chance of justice. The brutal murder of a family of 6 in the Hinterkaifeck farm. But thanks to people dedicated to the case, the internet and witnesses, photos of the crime scene and coroner reports, the story of the Gruber family's brutal end still stands the test of time.